Hey, students, we're almost to the end of this AP European History class. In fact, next week is really the last content lecture, and then we spend time reviewing for the AP test. In fact, this year we're already into the reviewing process, going back over the content information we could have, should have learned, and making sure it makes sense, that we can recall the important information, that we can understand the development and processes of history, that we understand how to cite and source the material that we're looking at. We understand how to make a claim and use evidence or provide evidence. We understand it's essential that we lay out the context of the situation in order to understand it fully. We're always trying to make connections. And of course, in all the writing that we do, we're writing in an argumentative style, right? We're using that claim, evidence, reasoning processes to understand history. And in history, the reasoning processes are to compare and to contrast, to show cause and effect, or of course, to demonstrate the continuity and change that happens over time. As we get to this point in class, I have to ask myself, and I'm asking you as the learner, at what point does history turn into just current events or the news? Because some of the things that I've talked about even last week or the week before during the Cold War and decolonization lectures, or this week during globalization, and next week, literally just kind of calling my notes like modern issues, at what point does it stop becoming history, air quotes here, and is it just, hey, I remember when this happened, right? And it's always, of course, dependent upon how old you are. But there are certain things that we discussed during the Cold War and during decolonization that I think I personally witnessed on the news when I was growing up. I remember talking about the Cold War not as a history lesson, but as a reality of what we were living in. I was born in the 70s, child of the 80s, went to high school in the 90s. And so the world has radically shifted since the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. And yet, the world's most populated country today, China, is still communist. There's still plenty of nukes to eradicate humankind. And so, at some point in a history class, hopefully the entire time we're in a history class, we're always tying what we're learning to the real world. And that's one of the issues that I always like to bring up in a good history class. It's really not about dead people whose names we'll never remember and we don't feel a connection to them at all. What we're really trying to do in a good history class is understand the world that we live in now. And we simply use history as one of the tools to understand how we got here, where we are, and to perceive the world as it really is. Right? We're on that quest to become less ignorant and to become more involved and to be good global citizens. So, this week, as we're talking about globalization, I hope you'll join me in understanding the world that we know. In this class, I have pushed and encouraged students to learn their geography so that when you look at the map of the world, you don't feel ignorant. The less ignorance there is, the more you understand. It just helps out so much. Every one of my AP students should be able to go around this map and know that this is Canada and the United States and Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, Cuba and the Bahamas and Jamaica and Haiti and Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, Colombia and Venezuela, Ecuador and Peru, Guyana, Suriname and French Guiana, Brazil, Bolivia, right? And Paraguay and Uruguay and Argentina and Chile, right? They should know that Ireland and the United Kingdom of Great Britain, right? They should know Portugal and Spain and France and Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg and Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right? Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Germany, and Poland right here. And you got Czech Republic and Slovakia and Switzerland and Austria and Italy. And you got Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia and Montenegro and Kosovo. And you've got Greece and you've got Bulgaria, Romania, right? Turkey, you've got Russia, you've got Japan and North and South Korea, you got China and Taiwan, which might not be an independent country, but there you go. Philippines, we've got places like Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and New Zealand and Australia, and you've got Malaysia and Brunei, and you've got Burma or Myanmar, and you've got Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and you've got Bhutan and Nepal and India and Pakistan, and you've got Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and Iran, and Iraq, and Syria, and Lebanon, and Jordan. And you've got Israel and Palestine, and you've got Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, and Oman, and United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, and Bahrain. And then you've got the continent of Africa with more than 50 countries, Morocco, and Algeria, and Libya, and Egypt, Tunisia, and Western Sahara, and Mauritania and Mali and Niger and Chad and well, Sudan, and there's not even South Sudan on this map. It's a little bit old. And you've got Ethiopia and Eritrea and Djibouti and Somalia. You've got Madagascar and South Africa and Lesotho and Swaziland and Namibia and Botswana and Angola. And you've got, your Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you've got Zambia and Zimbabwe. You've got Mozambique and Malawi. You've got Tanzania and Kenya. You've got Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And you've got the Republic of Congo. You've got Gabon, and you've got the Guinea, Equatorial Guinea. Sitom and Principe out there. You've got Central African Republic and Cameroon, Nigeria, and you've got Benin and Togo and Burkina Faso and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast and Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, and you've got Senegal and Gambia. And I'm sure that there's other countries that I didn't say because I was going through it quick. But as a European history student, it's really not just about Europe, it's about the entire world. And so as you've been in this class, I hope you felt like it's a world history class, because ultimately it is. My point was at the beginning, and still is, that over the last 500 years, like it or not, agree with it or not, Europeans have dominated the planet Earth. And I want you to know your world. And so at this point in class, if we were sitting in class, I would ask you to reflect on how different the world is now compared to when you started this class. And I hope it's better. It's deeper. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about perspective. Now we have to have some facts and we have to look at the data, but we have to be able to take that data and bring it to life. What country is the most important? Well, probably the country you live in, right? Because that's what's affecting you personally. But as far as being a global citizen, what country is the most important? Is it China? Because China is the most populated country. That means the most people on the planet Earth live there. So maybe that's the most important country. Or maybe it's India, which is going to surpass China in population in the next few years. But if you grow up in the United States and all you ever think about is the United States, you might have a not clear understanding of the rest of the world and our place in it, right? And that goes for any country that you live in. Is it the biggest country? Russia. Is it the richest country? Biggest GDP is the United States. But then we have to look at GDP versus the amount of people in the country. Then we start to get things like GDP per capita, right? Where we get a clearer understanding and where we're looking at, there's poor people in the United States, even though it has the biggest GPA, aka richest country. But is that wealth distributed in any kind of a fair and equitable way? And these are the kind of questions we ask in a social science class, okay? What country matters the most? How important is a country like Indonesia? Do you know what the population of Indonesia is? Because Indonesia is generally considered one of the biggest Islamic countries in the world. Indonesia right here has one of the biggest Muslim populations on the planet Earth. Pakistan does as well. Those two countries right there have far more Muslims than where we traditionally think of Islam. So if you're Islamic, how important is Indonesia? How important is a place like Pakistan? You know, how important is a place like Saudi Arabia? If you're a Christian, it kind of depends on what kind of Christian. But Italy might be the most important because in the heart of Rome, the capital city of Italy, lives the Pope, right? So, one of the things to consider, I just put some interesting facts, and it's not, you don't have to memorize these facts, but I hope it gives you some perspective on the world that you live in. 19% of the world's population lives in China. 20%? That's one out of every five people lives in China, one country. And India is right behind. 60% of all people on the planet Earth live in Asia. It is an Asian world that we live in. Here's something really fascinating to me. Um, Sometimes people say that the world is overpopulated, and I don't believe that it's overpopulated. I just believe it's horribly mismanaged. We have a country like Russia, absolutely the world's biggest country, land size. Okay. Then you get a country like Bangladesh that most people couldn't point to on a map. And yet there are far more people that live in Bangladesh than all of Russia. In fact, here's something that's kind of mind boggling. Canada is the world's second largest country, land size, and yet there are more people that live in the state of California than the country of Canada. And then you start looking at GDP, right? You look at the GDP of the United States, that's the gross domestic product, that's how big an economy is, which is the biggest. And yet you look at the population of the United States versus the population of India. And we start to ask ourselves serious questions. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about critical thinking skills, being able to take data and apply some emotion and connection to it. It's not just raw facts. We're able to manipulate those and to make a claim with evidence. So it's not just an opinion, and then tie it together with reasoning. That's the ultimate skill in this class. The purpose of this class is to expand your perception of the world that you live in. Wisdom is to see things as they really are or as they could be, not just how they were. True intelligence is being able to take facts or data and do something with it, to take the numbers and add an emotional connection to the facts. So again, I ask you, do you see the world differently now compared to when you started this class? Because if you don't, you failed. Erasing ignorance makes our world a better place. So, to kind of wrap up this class, one of the most important things that we need to discuss is the European Union. The European Union is kind of a sort of United States of Europe. I say kind of sort of is because it's not under one government like the United States is, although in the United States the separation of power under federalism between the states and the federal government is an ongoing debate that we've fought about in the Civil War, right? States' rights was one of the leading causes of the American Civil War. How much power should the federal government have versus how much sovereignty should an individual state have? And the European Union is a collection of European countries that work together economically and politically for the benefit of each other. The bottom line is that European countries by themselves cannot really compete with the economy of the United States after World War II. If I could just put this into perspective, the biggest economy in Europe right now, I'm recording this in 2021, Germany is the strongest economy, biggest economy in Europe, followed closely by Great Britain and France. They're right neck and neck all the time. And Italy's another big one that generally falls within the top 10 biggest economies in the world. So those four big, powerhouses economically, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Italy are really the strongest, most vital economies in Europe. If you were to take the country of France, which it depends on which website you go to and what information you're looking at. But France and Great Britain fall in like the fifth or sixth biggest economies in the world. If you take the economy of California by itself, without the other 49 states, California has about the same GDP as France. So countries like France can't compete with the United States economically by itself. And so a lot of these countries in Europe have joined together over time after World War II to economically compete with the United States. Formally, the European Union was organized in 1993 under the Maastricht Treaty, officially formed the European Union. There were 28, but now 27 member countries. One country was a part of the European Union, and one of them bailed, right? And that's Great Britain. Great Britain has been in the process for the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, trying to exit because they don't want the rest of Europe telling them how to run things in Great Britain. They want to have full sovereignty over their island. They have been a part of the European Union, but the Brexit started, somewhere around 2016. It's tough to nail down an exact date because these negotiations were going on for forever. But in 2020, honestly, just a few months ago, Boris Johnson, the current prime minister, was trying to put all of his ducks in order, if you will, to make sure that Great Britain exits or Brexits. That's the joke, right? Great Britain exiting the European Union because they want to have sovereignty. The problem is that's their major trade partners, and they're right next door to Europe. And so it has caused a little bit of issue. Not anything they'd be fighting over, but over trade routes and trade rules and tariffs and all that kind of jazz. Okay, so the European Union, or the EU, traces its roots back to the European coal and steel community. Um, in 1951, the ECC, a European Economic Community or Common Market, was put into place by at least 1957. So you can see during the Cold War that a lot of Western European countries that were rebuilding after the most destructive war in human history, they wanted to have financial security and play a major role in the world again. And so they started to cut down tariffs and open up more free trade. It started with like steel and coal, and then it started to expand to other commodities. And they signed treaties in Rome. They signed a treaty in different places in Europe, and pretty soon they start to get like the Benelux countries, like Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, starts to work with, like, say, France and West Germany and Italy, and they start to form a coalition. Great Britain does get involved, but Great Britain already has its Commonwealth of Nations. So it kind of has its own little network of other countries to kind of keep its economy strong and its trade partners powerful, left over from the old colonial eras. And so the European Union is a big deal. The EU has one of the largest economies in the world. When we judge the size of an economy, in economics, we use gross domestic product, all the services and products produced um, in a country accumulated just to see the size of the economy, and that kind of determines the value of an economy's currency, and affects its ability to negotiate trade agreements and such. Okay, the European Union established a common currency in Europe in 1999. It's called the euro, but not all EU countries use it. The first time I went to Europe was in 1998. And when I flew into France, I had to change my dollars to French francs. Then when I went over into, say, Spain, I had to change over to like the pesetas. And when I went into Italy, I had to change over to lire. And when you go into Germany, you had to change the Deutschmarks. And there's pounds and crowns, and I mean, there's so much different currency, all having different values. That makes trade tricky, especially when you're dealing with countries that are small and tightly packed together. So in 1999, they came up with a common currency that most European countries accept, the euro. Generally, the euro has been stronger than the dollar since its inception. In other words, 1 euro is more valuable than $1. But there were some countries that never used the euro, like the British refused to use the euro. because the pound is even stronger than the euro. So the British never gave up the pound. That's their currency. And randomly, like my wife and I went on a little trip to Denmark, and I don't know. I guess I should have done more research before I went to Denmark, but I brought all of my euros along. When I got to Denmark, I was like, oh, these guys aren't using the euro. They're still using their old currency. And I thought, well, they're a part of the European Union. So it was really fascinating to me which countries do use the euro, and there's a couple that don't. But it does make trade easier, and it makes, if you have such a strong economy backing a currency, the euros are incredibly powerful and well traded. Let's look at this chart right here in the top right hand corner. This is a 2021 estimate. This is as best an estimate as we have on the planet Earth in GDP. This is from the International Monetary Fund. This is the size of a country's economy. And the European Union is not a country, but it kind of functions like one. And there's 27 countries functioning together as one economy. They would be the second biggest economy in the world. Now, China is a singular country, and so on charts, you'll often see China as the world's second largest economy, followed after the United States. The United States came out on top in World War II. We came out economically good in World War I, but then we got a little bit overly excited, and people started buying too many things on credit or speculating too much, and then we hit the Great Depression. But by the time World War II was done, remember, we had what we called the Marshall Plan, where the United States basically said they would fund the rebuilding of Europe as long as European countries promised to buy their goods from the United States, which really, that means the last chunk of time since World War II, the United States has been dominant economically. Before that, European countries were the dominant power. So we really see a shift between the European countries dominating global economy. Again, so really World War I and World War II are what make that switch. It's really like the wealth of Europe was deposited in the United States as we mass produce goods for them to kill each other. Okay. But then you can see how many European countries fall within the top 10 biggest economies. Like I said, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Italy are generally always in the top 10. And then some of the Commonwealth nations of Great Britain, like India and Canada, are up there as well. So again, you can kind of see like shares of world GDP. This is saying, well, China actually has a bigger GDP, not that they make more money, but they have more economic power because of the number of their people and such. So it kind of depends on how economists run the numbers. But generally speaking, it's clear to see where the power of the world lies and what a small percentage other countries share as far as, look at this. I mean, this is the entire world in this little chart. You got 16.4% and 16.3% shares of world GDP. All three of these sharing 16% of the world's GDP, each one, the European Union, United States, and China, respectively. And then you see what a small percentage other countries are sharing, right? Little pieces of the pie, and then look what the rest of the world gets left with. So that's why sometimes people are frustrated and angry. How important is Europe in the modern 21st century? I hope these charts are really kind of showing you, wow, this is significant, and we still got to pay attention to European countries. And this map right here kind of shows you, again, kind of trying to lay out geographically where's the power in the world. Okay. And look who gets shafted all the time: Africa. That imperialism that tore apart Africa in the late 1800s and during the 1700s and 1600s and 1500s was slavery. I mean, man, hopefully in the future, Africa will get its fair shake at being successful. I've got some great videos that if we are in class, I would show. I hope you take time to watch some of them or all of them. This is a short video on the European Union explained. This right here, of course, is the flag of the European Union. And these are the countries that are a part of the European Union. But Great Britain is exiting. They started several years ago exiting, and they're still wrapping up all the fine details by the end of 2020. So they're going to be exited from this map very soon. One of the other problems that happens in a place like Europe with criminals, if you commit a crime in Austria and you cross over the border into Germany, the jurisdiction of Austria is done. So now German police don't even know they're looking for a crime that happened in Austria. And that would happen all over the place. And it's even worse. Germany and Austria both speak German, right? They speak the same language. So that's an easy kind of a deal. But if you go from a country like Germany and France, which were old enemies, and in France, they don't even call Germany Germany. If you're in France, you call this country Alemania. If you're actually in this country and you speak German, you don't call it Germany either. You call it Deutschland. And so these language barriers and political differences, complicated pasts, international borders. There is an organization, of course, the International Police Organization, or Interpol. Maybe you've heard that in spy movies and stuff, where police departments will collaborate and work with each other, so that if you commit a crime in France, but you're arrested in Spain, the Spanish police know to look for you, even though you didn't commit the crime in France, in Spain, you still could be extradited easily back to France. Those kind of things get complicated, as you might guess. It's complicated to understand. It's even more complicated to negotiate and work and run. Not surprising, Switzerland has opted not to be a part of the European Union. Some other random places like Norway and Iceland also opt to not be involved in the European Union because they want to keep sovereignty and make their own laws. That creates a really weird thing because you can cross the border from, say, Sweden into Norway without having to show passport. Just like if you were driving from California to Utah, when you cross into Nevada, you don't have to show a passport. When you go into Arizona, you don't have to show a passport. And then finally, when you arrive at your destination in Utah, the only way the police could track you is by following your credit card, right? I mean, there's no identification that has to be shown per se. And that is very true on most of the continent of Europe in what they call the Schengen area. So, like for instance, I took a road trip in Europe a few years back with my family. We flew into Deutschland, or Germany, and then we traveled up to the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and down to Brussels and Belgium, and spent time in Paris and Normandy, and then of course went through Luxembourg. No passports. We didn't have to show a passport until when we flew into Germany. We did, but then when we were driving around, it was just like crossing state borders, if that makes sense. There are some that have special status requirements. Great Britain does require passport enter and exit, and they try to keep it that way. And of course, Denmark was a random kind of different one too. Again, a very nice place. I think everybody in Denmark is like a model. I didn't see an ugly person in the entire country except for me when I looked in the mirror. But honestly, it's an amazing place. So clean, nice, beautiful, just freaking amazing. But yeah, they kind of run their own program, and I've got to kind of respect that in a lot of ways, because as an American, that's a big deal for states to control their own destiny. Again, modern economics in Europe, great video if we were in class. And if you want further explanation on how complicated Brexit is, well, there's 4 videos to choose from. The basic plot is Great Britain has been working on and is exiting from the European Union because they want to have full autonomy over their own country. Now, this brings us to another incredibly important international organization to understand the modern world that we live in, and that is the United Nations. After World War I, the Allies helped to establish an organization known as the League of Nations. The United States was one of the main countries pushing for a League of Nations because of the destruction of World War I. most countries that survived that, and some countries didn't survive, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart, was diced apart. The Ottoman Empire was diced apart. Even the German Empire was dismantled. The Russian Empire fell apart. The only empire to really survive World War I was the British, right? Um, but the United States and her allies in World War I really pushed for a League of Nations. Ironically, the U.S. didn't join, and that's because of how politics work in our country. The president didn't have the power to make the United States join. That the power was left in the hands of Congress. And even though the president pushed for it, Woodrow Wilson, Congress didn't solidify his desires or his action, and so the U.S. didn't join, and it fell apart. And obviously, we ran into World War II. So after World War II, the UN was formed to allow for a place to discuss issues and to prevent another global war. So some people say, well, we still have plenty of war, so maybe the UN doesn't work. But then some people might point or make a claim that the UN is good because we didn't have World War III. So a claim could be made that the UN is very successful because we didn't have World War III. And during the Cold War, there were some pretty tense times in the United Nations. I remember hearing those stories about, like say, the United States goes into the UN and the Russians are there, and the Russians say, "Hey, have you been sending planes over our sovereign territory and spying on us?" And the U.S. says, "No, we would never do that." And then the Soviets say, "Well, we know you are. We have one of your pilots captured. We shot down a U-2 plane." Oh, they bait each other. Same kind of thing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, hey, Soviet Union, are you guys placing nuclear warheads in Cuba off the coast of the United States? Oh, no, we would never do that. Oh, really? Well, look at these pictures we took over Cuba where there's clearly Soviet personnel building, missile silos in Cuba. So what do you have to say about that? So it was tense sometimes, but still we haven't had World War III. Now there are some countries that don't like the UN because if you give power to the UN, then that's alleviating power from your own country, and thus it's affecting your sovereignty. If the UN is an international organization, where do you put the headquarters? Well, the United States, because it was really the one country that won World War II that wasn't completely in shambles, because none of the conflict actually happened on American soil. And if you're like, well, Hawaii, yeah, well, Hawaii was a territory. It wasn't even a state. There was some fighting on American territory, Guam, talking to you, or, Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. Even some of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska could claim that Japanese invaded. But really, there was no fighting in the United States. And so it was the clear place. And New York has become the financial capital of the world in a lot of ways, certainly of the US. And so if you go to New York City, that's where the UN is headquartered. And there's a little chunk of New York that's technically international territory right downtown in Manhattan. A couple of subway stops from the Statue of Liberty, and you can get to the UN headquarters. There are some other important locations located in Europe, particularly Geneva, Switzerland. Switzerland is like the most neutral country on the planet Earth. It escaped both World War I and World War II. So if you want to go see what Europe looked like, before bombs were dropped and destroyed everything, Switzerland is the place to go. It is one of the nicest countries on the planet Earth, famous for its banking, its financial stability, its lack of graffiti, its beautiful landscapes. I mean, if you ever want to go somewhere like one of the most beautiful places in the world, Switzerland is amazing. There's another really important center in the Netherlands called The Hague or Den Haag, and that's where you'd find the International Court of Justice or the World Court. So if we catch somebody like Slobodan Milosevic or say like Saddam Hussein, or we find somebody who's been committing crimes in their country and yet they run their country, so obviously their country is not going to punish that person. If we have the ability to pull that person into, like, say, the World Court, then we might be able to hold them accountable for the crimes they commit on their people. Most countries in the world are part of the UN, and most countries will send an ambassador to represent their country to the UN. So if you're an ambassador to the UN from, say, the United States or China or France or Great Britain or any of the nuclear powers, that's a big deal, right? You have a lot of clout and power. There is something called the Security Council that runs the UN. The 5 winners of World War II are still permanent members of the Security Council and have absolute veto power. So Russia, United States, China, Great Britain, and France have veto power. The other positions in the Security Council rotate. And of course, the UN selects a Secretary General. So this is the question people ask themselves: how much power should the UN have? I'm kind of talking about it in a history class, but it's still very relevant today. The UN still gets involved in things, but should it get involved in things? Should it get involved in the internal affairs of a country? Sometimes more dominant countries like the United States or Russia will say that country needs to be intervened in because they're not able to take care of themselves. It's kind of like if parents are having issues in their home, the state of California might come in and remove kids from a home. And you might say, well, those are the parents. That's their house. But if they're not even able to function as a family, maybe the state needs to intervene. That's kind of the idea or premise, behind the UN. Sometimes the UN will step into a country and say, hey, we're going to take over for a little while, or we're at least going to put peacekeeping forces in here because obviously you guys are not able to run your own affairs. What is the UN? I've got 3 great videos here, and there's probably 20,000 other ones on YouTube about the UN. And again, we're not even talking history anymore. We're talking about things going on right now. Even though the UN was created right after World War II, it's still such a relevant piece of the world and how it affects us. This is what the building looks like in New York City, with flags from around the world, and of course the main chamber in the United Nations. And of course, it's designed to prevent future wars, right? Now, one of the things we want to talk about are some modern conflicts. And again, these are things that happened at the very tail end of the Cold War. Like one of the things that I remember particularly when I was in high school, I remember coming home. I was on the varsity wrestling team. I played, varsity football, and I got into all kinds of sports. But I remember coming home on a bus, and the song stopped right in the middle, and there was this news report. The United States has bombed Iraq, and all of us were like, "What?" We grew up hearing stories about Vietnam. We grew up hearing stories about the Korean War, or maybe from both of my grandpas served in World War II. But to hear something like that in my own lifetime, that felt so much more significant. So the first Gulf War took place from 1990 to 1991. Coalition forces under the command of NATO. I bring this up because it wasn't the United States fighting the war; it was a coalition of countries. And really, it was led by NATO, that organization that was created during the Cold War. Saddam Hussein was the big bad guy, and some people were referring to him kind of like Hitler. They're like, man, if we don't stop this guy, he's going to be the next Hitler. He was killing people in his own country. He was gassing them. He had weapons of mass destruction. He invaded a neighboring country of Kuwait. He had bought all of his equipment from the Soviet Union. So it was a real test of American machinery and American personnel against Soviet equipment, which we hadn't done during the Cold War, even though we planned for that confrontation. It never happened. Saddam Hussein had already proved that he was a villain. During the 1980s, he fought a war with the neighboring country of Iran, and millions of people were killed. I remember when I was a kid hearing stories about the Iran and Iraq war and how bad it was. Okay, and Saddam Hussein was shooting missiles, these tactical ballistic missiles, into neighboring countries, especially Israel, trying to provoke a broader, grander Middle Eastern war, trying to say, hey, it's us Muslims against you guys. It didn't quite buy in. But this is the first Iraq war, right? Called Operation Desert Storm. Saddam remained in power even after the war, which led to a second Gulf War in 2003 to 2011. It was part of the grander war on terrorism after the 9/11 incident. He was captured in the end and executed for his war crimes. But this is the kind of stuff I used to watch on TV. We used to make jokes. How many CNN reporters does it take to shoot a Scud missile? Sorry, I totally ruined that joke. It was how many Iraqis does it take to shoot a Scud missile? And the joke was, well, it takes three. One of them pushes the button, and then one of them has to run in and watch CNN to find out where it landed, because CNN was like the first 24-hour news channels. So we grew up kind of watching it live. I totally ruined that joke, sorry, but it wasn't even that funny when I heard it back in the day, but it was pretty true. I mean, sometimes the U.S. military would be like, how does CNN know what's going on before we do, kind of a thing. Also, one of the things that happened in the Gulf War, the United States really controlled what information the media got to a certain extent. During the Vietnam War, the press had like free reign of the battlefield, and they could report anything they wanted to. And it really kind of got people disliking the U.S. military. Vietnam's one of those sore spots because we see death and destruction and we know it's Americans causing it. So how you control the propaganda ends up really kind of how the war is reflected in history, right? And again, all kinds of interesting understanding our place in the modern world. On September 11th of 2001, there was a terrorist attack in the United States where 4 planes were hijacked. 2 crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, 1 into the Pentagon, which is the top military command center just outside of Washington, D.C. And the last one never reached its target. Most people feel like it was probably the White House. It crashed in Pennsylvania. Somewhere around 3,000 people were killed in these attacks. A terrorist network took credit for it. They were called Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda, depending on what part of the United States you're from and how you want to pronounce that. And they were kind of backed by the ruling Taliban in Afghanistan. The leader of that group, Al-Qaeda, was Osama bin Laden. He carried out the terrorist attacks on Americans before 9/11. He actually I remember I actually went to Africa in 1998, and so it kind of is a little more relevant for me. Again, that's where it's history versus like, hey, I remember that. I went to Africa for the first time in 1998, 2 Muslim countries, and I remember seeing on the news that U.S. embassies had been blown up and hundreds of Americans had been killed. So the United States knew about Osama bin Laden before 9/11. In fact, the United States was funding his operation via the CIA and covert operations in Afghanistan, going all the way. We can trace the roots all the way back to the 1980s when we were using, this organization to fight against the Soviets during the Cold War. So we may have created our own monsters. Political instability, civil war, piracy, AIDS, poverty, genocide have plagued the continent of Africa and around the world. Okay. And again, it's one of those things where you start to like, well, where is it history and where is it, hey, this is just the story of mankind and what we're doing. The war on terrorism is probably something you guys grew up hearing about. Again, you guys, I've been teaching for almost 20 years. And so I remember going to a classroom, having a lesson ready to teach, and on the way to the classroom on the news, I heard about a plane that flew into the World Trade Center, and I was like, wow, that pilot was an idiot. That was bad. And then as we, kind of started to watch a little bit of TV that morning, like literally in the classroom, this is before YouTube existed. We actually watched things on TV, cable, right? Or satellite. So we start watching the news, and another plane hits the other tower. Now it's not an accident. Now this looks purposeful, right? And it starts to unfold, and we start to hear about what's happening, and people start throwing out names like Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and the Taliban and right Islamic fundamentalism, and they start using words like jihad or jihadists. I think it's really important to understand that this was not sanctioned by the religion of Islam. People who really follow Islam are nice and peaceful, and it's just like if somebody committed a murder and you found out that that person was raised a Christian, does that mean that Christians are bad people, that the Christians teach to kill? Because if we look at the 30 Years' War, that was a war of Christians killing Christians. Or if we look at the French War of Religion, Christians killing each other over which Christian church is right. So that doesn't mean that's what Christianity teaches, though. We got to be able to separate people's actions versus what a religion teaches. Okay. And I've been to several Islamic countries, and I find it beautiful and interesting. I've gone and seen mosques, and I've read pieces of the Quran, and I find it very fascinating. So sometimes people erroneously associate those actions, and it's a very unfortunate thing. But that's why we have history classes. If you really get into history class and learn what happened, and you start to think critically, and you're not brainwashed by ignorance, then we can learn. Again, the United States did fight a second Gulf War. In the end, most people think that this was a faulty war. And a lot of people ask, why did we go into Iraq a second time? The U.S. says that they received intel that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Later on, a lot of the evidence looks faulty. The United States made a claim. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We went in and we fought a war, and in the end, people said, okay, well, where's the evidence, And we had a hard time providing that evidence. And so there's some people who say, shouldn't have gone into Iraq a second time. In the more recent years, within the last, say, 10 or so years, there's been some major revolutionary issues that have happened in the Arab world. A lot of people refer to it as the Arab Spring, revolutionary waves, protest, people using social media to try to enact change. And it overthrew some of the oldest regimes in the world. There was this guy named Muammar Gaddafi. I remember him being like, I kind of thought of him at the same level as Hitler when I was growing up. Like, he was this evil terrorist, bad guy who ran the country of Libya, and yet he was finally overthrown during this Arab Spring. But then again, who replaces Gaddafi? Sometimes these countries don't have a functioning government, and so terrorist organizations, terrorize the people and run the countries. And so some of the countries have come out of the Arab Spring good, and some of them are literally still in civil war, like Syria, like Yemen. Iraq is still trying to be rebuilt. There's some serious issues, and I wouldn't go to Libya if I had the chance today, because it's a scary place with not a lot of law and order. U.S. embassies have been attacked in some of these kind of places. In the recent history, I'm talking the last 10 years or so. In fact, this last little thought here, there's a major, huge civil war that's been going on in Syria since 2011. U.S. has actually sent troops into Syria to fight ISIS, right, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And Russia supports one side, and the U.S. supports the other side, and it kind of sounds like it's the Cold War again. This is pictures of 9/11. This is Osama bin Laden, who eventually was shot and killed. But this is some of the terrorist attacks he did before 9/11 against American targets in Africa at some of our embassies. So what's next? And are we done with these terrorist attacks? Is the war on terror over? Where will the next attack be? As Americans, we like to focus on American, terrorist attacks. But there's been a huge number of European terrorist attacks. Everybody's heard of 9/11, okay? But did you know that there was a Madrid train bombing? Madrid is the capital of Spain. Almost 200 people were dead and 2,000 people injured. That's big. In London, 2005, some bombings, 56 people dead, 784 injured, right? Even in places like Oslo, Norway, Paris, France, street shootings, right down the Champs-Élysées kind of place. Brussels, Belgium. Again, I don't know if you remember this a few years back, but one of the airport in Brussels was bombed, right? A terrorist cell. Nice, France, a truck attack. Guy didn't have guns or explosives, so he took a truck and started running people over. 87 people killed, 430 injured. So people started to do like knife attacks or using trucks as weapons, vehicles as weapons. There's an arena bombing. I mean, and I probably should update my list because there's been others as well. So I think it's important to be informed, not to be scared, but to be informed and to understand what's going on, where is it happening, how does it affect you. I think one of the most troubled places on the planet Earth is Israel. I could spend days talking about Israel because I find it incredibly fascinating, but I'm not going to, overshoot it here. There's two countries, kind of. There's supposed to be two countries, Israel and Palestine. The conflict is over the Holy Land. That's what people call it, right? The Holy Land. It goes back to biblical times over 4,000 years ago. If you know the Bible really good, I could teach you even more because we could take biblical stories. When Moses takes the children of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land, that's what we're talking about. But of course, when Moses is going to take the children of Israel into the promised land, he's commanded by God, according to the Bible, to kick everybody out of the Holy Land who doesn't believe in the one true living God. It's actually Joshua that takes the children of Israel in, and they dice up the land between the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is biblical stuff, right? And then the people of Palestine, right, or the Philistines in the Bible, end up fighting epic wars with the children of Israel. So this goes back to biblical times. Now, to not overcomplicate this, eventually the Jewish territory is conquered by in the Bible by the Babylonians. Well, first it's conquered by what we'd call the Assyrians, and then a Neo-Babylonian empire, and then the Persians. That might be the most simplistic way. And oh my goodness, you could spend days and hours talking about that. Eventually, the Greeks come in and conquer the Persians, and so that this territory falls under Hellenistic rule. And then eventually, right around the year 0 on the Christian calendar, the Romans are occupying this territory. In fact, it's the Romans that killed Jesus, right? They're the ones that nailed him to a cross after his own people turned him in. And then after that, the Jewish people rebel against Rome, and Rome decimates Israel and takes the Jewish people and disperses them throughout the Roman Empire. Jewish people refer to this as the diaspora. I remember growing up and I kept wondering, why were there so many Jewish people in Germany for the Nazis to hate on? And why was there so many Jewish people in Poland or Russia or any part of Europe? I'm like, their home territory is the Holy Land, right? Around Jerusalem. So why are there so many Jewish people in Europe? And that goes back to this diaspora where the Roman Empire dispersed the Jewish people. Anyways, during the 1800s, there was a whole bunch of Jewish people in Europe who wanted to return to their Holy Land, and it started a whole wave of this return to their promised land, right? The biblical lands, and they called it Zionism, right? Israeli Zionism started in the early 1800s as Jewish people all over the world started to return to their traditional homelands, kind of ending this diaspora. During World War I, the British were looking for people to help them fight the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. And so the British Empire made deals with the Arabs and the Jews in the area, promising things that they maybe didn't intend to fulfill. Maybe they did. It's called the Balfour Declaration. The British said, hey, Jewish people living in the Holy Land, if you guys help us beat the Turks, we'll give you a country. But then they turned around at the same time and they said, "Hey, Arab people, Muslims, if you help us defeat the Turks, who are also Muslim, but if you help us defeat the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, then we'll give you a country." In the end, they didn't give either one a country. They kept it for themselves under a mandate system, right? They partitioned off the old Ottoman Empire. So the modern country of Israel is actually established after World War II in 1948. The United States had a lot to do with this. We really pushed for it. After all of the destruction on the Jewish people as a part of the Holocaust, the United States and the newly formed UN decided to make and establish a country, but they actually decided to establish two countries. They established one for Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and then they established one for the Jewish people, Israeli people, right? These Hebrew people, these Jews. And then they originally kept Jerusalem as like an independent, as a UN city, I think was the technical terminology. But after Israel declared its independence, all the surrounding countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they all attacked the newly formed country of Israel. And so the Israeli army had to fight for its independence right after World War II. Those same countries basically attacked Israel again, and Israel won in 6 days. I mean, there's a lot of history here that I'm kind of skimming over. There's even a third war called the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is like it's like the Day of Atonement. It's like one of the most holy days in the whole Jewish calendar. I know you guys probably heard of like Hanukkah and Passover and stuff, but Yom Kippur is a big deal, especially in Israel. And so Israel's been attacked by its neighbors so many times that it finally started to militarily occupy territory. And so there's a lot of dispute. Should Israel still be militarily occupying pieces of the surrounding countries and the territory that was rightfully for the Palestinians? But then Israel says, well, you guys attacked us. And so there's been an uprising, an intifada. And again, I wish I could take 2 or 3 hours and teach you about this. It's freaking amazing. It's the Holy Land, right? The center of the Bible. And there has been, like I said, at least 3 wars against Israel in the last 50 years. Technically, there's 2 pieces of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. The country of Israel militarily occupies the West Bank and has cut off Gaza and has even stationed troops into a part of Syria called the Golan Heights. And again, you want more information, talk to me sometime outside of class, and I can go off for hours about Israel. It's a fascinating place to me, just because of the depth of what's happened there and what is happening there. When you watch the news, you'll notice that sometimes news focus on domestic issues. Domestic issues are those things that happen within your own country. And sometimes, like the US news media, will overly emphasize American news because that's what sells. Remember that news broadcast companies are in the business of selling news, not necessarily telling you the truth. Foreign issues are a big deal, but you got to really pay attention because again, sometimes local news will talk more about traffic and a shooting that happened down on whatever street, or a robbery or a burglary, rather than these giant international stories. But what affects you more? That robbery or that shooting at the local grocery store, or the fact that Russia is getting aggressive in the Crimea again. So things outside of our country that affect the whole world. There is tremendous international pressure, right? Economic recession is always a big deal. Despite the euro becoming a very powerful currency, many economic issues plague the EU. And there's been some question as new countries join the EU. Maybe some of them weren't so honest when they joined the EU. And so some countries like Germany have to pull their weight, while some countries like maybe, say, Greece, aren't as economically powerful, and they're kind of bringing the European Union economy down where Germany's building it up. And that creates tension. Just saying that out loud could cause people to get angry in the comments on a YouTube video like this. So the EU was bailing out certain countries, deeming it too big to fail. There's still a lot of religious tension in Europe. But it's not so much like when we talked in class in the Reformation, there was Protestant and Christian, that's two forms of Christians killing each other. You do find some of that, especially in Ireland, like the IRA, the Republic Army of Ireland. There was bombings and terrorist attacks, Protestants versus Catholics. So there is still some tension like that. But the bigger tension right now in Europe is Islamic immigrants coming from poorer countries into European society and bringing Islam with them. And there has been some terrorist attacks. And so there does seem to be some negativity towards immigration. And that's the biggest issue right now, I would say, and it has been for the last 5 or more years. It's been a growing problem. Immigration and refugees. If you've ever watched videos of those small rafts, people trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa or from the Middle East, and places like Greece get bombarded, people coming out of the Middle East. It's changing the culture and affecting it. It seems ironic that this is coming to bite Europe in the butt after hundreds of years of taking over the world, right? Remember, Europeans went into these countries and forced their religion and their ideas and their language on the people that they conquered. And now they have the audacity to get angry when these people are coming into their country and bringing their language and their foreign ideas and their, different religious ideas, and it's affecting the religion or culture of the country that they come into. And I'm like, hey, that's called irony. It doesn't justify violence, but it helps explain why there's tension there. And I think that's kind of what happened during the age of imperialism, right? There was a huge meltdown in 2008. Financially, it rocked the U.S. and it rocked Europe. There's a lot of parallels that happened between Europe and the United States. So studying one definitely helps you study the other. Terrorism is not always Islamic extremists, as this chart clearly shows. There are plenty of other terrorist attacks that have nothing to do with Islam, but it depends on what the media portrays, right? And that can be a huge issue. What is the media portraying? This right here kind of shows you where the majority of immigrants are coming from into European countries. And you'll see sometimes the media dramatizes stuff. Again, they're trying to sell, that's they're a business, so they might show a picture of a baby floating dead in the Mediterranean, and like, here's this European migration crisis or immigration crisis, and we do the same thing in the United States. The last president, Trump, was talking about building a wall along the border of Mexico to prevent immigrants coming across because it's going to affect our economy, and same thing is happening in Europe. They're like, hey, let's put a gate up, let's put a fence up, let's not let so many people flood into our countries. It's affecting our economy. And that's where we find ourselves as we tackle things from the past. We look at things that are happening currently, and ultimately we're trying to track down and understand, where does history become current events? Why is it so important for citizens of a republic to stay informed? Why do you need to learn a history class? If you walk away from this class thinking, man, why do we waste our time learning about dead people that don't even affect my world, then we really failed. Because what people did in the past affect us today. How does history affect our current events? I've tried to point it out, and less this year because we're doing this online digital learning. But generally in my class, I force my students to pay attention to the news at least once a week. And this year, I encourage that. I hope that was beneficial to you. And I hope, like, even one time in class, I showed, this is 2021, right? 2021 this year. And I showed a video of a World War II bomb being detonated in a British town as they were doing construction. This year. So history does still affect us, and not just in the obvious bomb going off, but in how we see the world, why we have certain expectations, why our country sees itself the way we do. So, where should we look to find well balanced, unbiased, credible sources for our news? Unfortunately, I have no freaking idea because all of the news seems to be unbalanced. It seems to be very one sided. There are liberal news stations and there are conservative news stations, and it can get very frustrating to the point where some people they start to say, "Hey, can you just tell me what's really happening? I don't want to hear your opinion of what's happening." We've kind of created ourselves a mess in a lot of ways. If you want to pay attention to local news, that seems to be a little bit less biased. The more international or at least national that it is, it seems to be really swayed in one direction or the other. Who really controls the news? Who controls what you see? If something happens and a major news station doesn't cover it, did it really happen? You know that question, they say, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody was there to hear it, did it really make a sound? If the news doesn't cover it, did it really happen? What if it was really important, but the people who own the news companies choose not to run that story? Are we really getting the whole picture? Who controls the news? Who controls the media? Who controls what you see? Are those corporations out there to tell you the truth, or are they out there to make money? This might help you. With the 24-hour news cycle, it's changed how we see and what gets covered. And there's a difference between journalists who want to find the truth and news agencies that just want to sell product. There are liberal media outlets, and there are conservative media outlets, and there are some that fall, closer to the center. You know, there are some that do a good job of fact reporting and sourcing and citing. That's one of the key things in this class, right? Well, where's the proof? And then there are some that, seem to steep themselves into opinion more than fact oriented, hey, here's what really happened, and you make your own choices. And then there are some that just get out there where they're being incorrect, and it can, you hear it, oh, it's got to be true. I read it on the internet. So we have to be very careful of how we consume media. And I don't even have all the answers because it's tricky. It really is. There's a ton of videos right here. We're getting very close to the end of all of this. Got some great videos on globalization, on Israel, right? The Israeli conflict, Islam, science and technology and protests that are happening in Western Europe, and of course some AP review videos, along with some that will feel like more news, right? Instead of like a video on history, it's like, well, this kind of just seems like a news report. Anyways, I hope you have taken some time to watch some of those and to truly understand globalization. And thank you for being with me. And next week I'll probably wrap up what I'm going to call modern issues. And then after that, we're just going to be reviewing up for the AP test. If you have any questions, bring them to class. Thanks for being with me. This is week 32 on globalization.